Then
Little footnote to the last segment. Few people writing to say that Bill Horowitz is listed as the writer of the Rosemary Wood song that Amy in Manhattan graced us with a few lines of in song, not just the singer. So that credit where credit is due. And listeners, it's newsletter day, and you can sign up for free for the Brian Lehrer Show newsletter. It includes a weekly column from me. It's written and ready to send. A reader question for you to answer if you choose, and some other features. To sign up, just go to wnyc.org/BL newsletter, wnyc.org/BL newsletter. It'll come to your inbox today and every Thursday afternoon. On WNYC, name a country where the U.S. is aiding and abetting genocide by selling arms to a perpetrator nation. Okay, I know which one you're all thinking, and that debate is important and has proven itself to be central to the midterm elections this year. But do you even know about this one? Here is Democratic Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs, ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, at a hearing in December on countries aiding the slaughter and displacement crisis in Sudan.
The UAE, for example, is the main backer of the RSF and has made it possible for its genocide to take place. At this point, we've all seen the widespread and credible reporting detailing the UAE's funneling of weapons to the RSF and their efforts to hide it. But instead of using the U.S.'s significant leverage to pressure the UAE to stop arming the RSF, the Trump administration blew through Ranking Member Meek's congressional hold in May and approved a $1 billion arms sale.
Trump's relationship with the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, is suspected by Congressmember Jacobs and other Democrats of being corrupt as the UAE enables the globally and bipartisanly recognized genocide in Sudan. Just yesterday, you probably haven't heard this, I saw it in the Washington Post, Senator Elizabeth Warren sent a letter to Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick asking whether the administration's decision to ease export controls on the United Arab Emirates was influenced by UAE-linked investments in the Trump family's crypto venture. Now, how bad is the situation in Sudan? The BBC reports nearly 12 million people driven from their homes and famine conditions continuing. The International Rescue Committee, the big refugee aid and policy group, said this year that Sudan tops its watch list as the country most likely to experience a worsening humanitarian crisis. So with us now, Kieran Donnelly, the International Rescue Committee's Senior Vice President for International Programs, Crisis Response, Recovery, and Development. He oversees humanitarian programs in Sudan and more than 40 other countries worldwide. Also with us is Mark Townsend, Senior Global Development Reporter for The Guardian and author of the 2020 book, No Return, The True Story of How Martyrs Are Made, about Brits who got radicalized and went to fight in Syria back at that time. Mark from The Guardian, welcome, and Kieran from the IRC, welcome back to WNYC.
Thanks for having me on, Brian.
Do we have both of you?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Good. Kieran, why is Sudan at the top of your watch list as the country most likely to experience a worsening humanitarian crisis?
First, Brian, I want to thank you for shining a light on the situation in Sudan, which gets regrettably little attention in global media these days. So very much appreciate the opportunity. In our 2026 watch list, we identified 3 factors that are accelerating the impact of humanitarian crises globally: an increasingly transactional and exploitative approach to conflicts around the world, increased impunity for attacks against civilians and aid workers, and a dramatic reduction in support for both humanitarian response to the impacts of crisis and political and diplomatic engagement to bring about an end to conflict and crisis. Sudan tops our watch list for this year and has remained there because all of these trends, all of these dynamics are really turbocharging the continued conflict across the country, as we're seeing currently in the situation around El Obeid city in North Kordofan, and the impact on humanitarian, on civilian populations, which is really catastrophic.
Mark, most Americans know very little about Sudan, as Kieran was just indicating, or the parties to the war there. The current war broke out in 2023 between the SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, controlled by the current government, and the opposition military known as the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF. Who, in brief, are these two opposing forces, and what interests are they fighting over?
Okay, yeah. So the RSF, ostensibly, it's been likened to a kind of massive organized crime group, basically, with massive weaponry, funded to the hilt by the Emiratis. It's made up of kids, mercenaries, very poor communities, been dragged in right across the Sahel in Africa. And that's a group that's been accused of genocide by the US. And it's lined up against as you said, the military, which, again, it's kind of courted controversy. It's aligned with various Islamist factions. And the truth is, there's no angels in this war. It's a bitter, brutal battle with no quarter given. And the aim, really, in the simplest terms, is total control of Sudan. It's a highly strategic country, huge gold reserves, Red Sea access, and both sides shown a sign of backing down.
Mark, you heard the clip of the Congresswoman objecting to a $1 billion U.S. arms sales to the United Arab Emirates, despite the UAE's role in arming the RSF. What is the USE's interest, causing it to take a side in Sudan's civil war?
Yeah, I mean, again, it wants it's rolling out, almost like a sort of new imperial ambition to control much of Africa, which it sees as its kind of post-oil future, and Sudan, it's incredibly well situated in terms of strategic interests for the Gulf state, and in the meantime, while the war's ongoing, it has huge access to illegally plundered gold, and all with view of some point getting hold of the country.
Kieran, I'm far from an expert on Sudan, but from what I read, the refugee crisis, or call it a genocide as many parties do, is more on the RSF opposition forces than on the government forces. Would you describe it that way?
We're seeing humanitarian impact across the country in areas controlled by both the RSF and the Sudanese Armed Forces. It's not our role as an operational organization to apportion blame. I will leave that to others, but I can speak with authority to the impact on the civilian population of the country. 33 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. Well over half of those are children. There's about 13 million people who've been displaced from their homes, including many of the IRC's own 550 plus staff that we have based in the country. So we're seeing this impact spread across the country and continue to worsen as the war drags on.
So at the same time, we're sending arms to the UAE, which in turn is sending arms to the RSF, just as critics of U.S. Gaza policy blame the Biden administration in addition to Trump. Congresswoman Jacobs did that too in her hearing regarding Sudan. Here's 30 seconds of her on that.
And to be clear, this criticism is not specific to this administration. I was also critical of the Biden administration's unwillingness to hold the UAE accountable. I believe that the United States needs to use its significant leverage with the UAE to pressure them to finally end their support to the RSF. That's why I've introduced the Stand Up for Sudan Act that would do just that, and why I've joined with Ranking Member Meeks as a co-lead of the U.S. engagement in Sudanese Peace Act, which would cut off arms to any country sending weapons to the RSF or the SAF.
Again, Democratic Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs of California, San Diego area to be specific, ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa at a hearing she led in December. But Kieran, she also said at that hearing, she also cited ways that the Trump administration is enabling the humanitarian crisis to unfold that Biden didn't also do. Do you have at the IRC examples of that? Or I will play a clip of her in a minute where she cites at least one.
It's hard for me to speak to specific examples of that, and I think it's probably important for me to acknowledge that the U.S. government is among those donors who are providing funding for humanitarian response. But at the same time, it's very clear from our experience on the ground that regional and global players are not doing everything in their power to bring about an end to the crisis. The reason the conflict in Sudan continues is because actors on the ground can act with continued impunity and support from their regional and global backers. And that's very much translating into the attacks we're seeing on civilians, the devastating attacks in El Fasher, in Darfur in October of last year, the catastrophic situation unfolding in El Obeid right now. We're seeing drone attacks on humanitarian supply convoys and on civilians, as well as horrific assaults against women and girls fleeing from conflict zones.
And you say the U.S. is among those contributing humanitarian aid, but I want to play one more clip of Congresswoman Jacobs from that hearing she led in December.
Earlier this year, Secretary Rubio cut millions of dollars in assistance to Sudan as part of President Trump's sham foreign assistance review and illegal dismantling of USAID. For example, USAID was previously supporting the heroic efforts of the Sudanese emergency response rooms to open community kitchens and provide basic meals to Sudanese civilians throughout the country. These kitchens are uniquely situated to assist communities cheaper and faster than traditional NGOs, which is why the Biden administration started funding them. But the Trump administration cut all funding for these kitchens, forcing nearly 80% of all ERR activities to stop and affecting over 1,460 community kitchens operating across Sudan, cutting off vulnerable Sudanese civilians from life-saving food assistance. Today, nearly 250 kitchens remain closed, and 315 kitchens can only provide one meal a day. And that is just one example of the administration's counterproductive actions.
So, Kieran, I'll stay with you on this for one more question before going back to Mark. Is the IRC, as a relief organization, seeing or feeling the effects of the things that the Congress member just listed there, or of shutting down USAID in general, or otherwise reducing foreign aid for people in Sudan or elsewhere, or has a lot of that been reversed since the time more than 6 months ago that she made that statement?
We've seen a resumption of U.S. foreign assistance from the State Department, principally provided through the intermediary of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It has not returned to the levels of previous funding either in Sudan or globally. And this is in the context in Sudan specifically, where only 15% of humanitarian response plans are funded currently. Leaving a huge gap in aid delivery and also a global retreat, not just from the US government, but from others, from humanitarian budgets, which have been cut by between 25 and 30% globally. So that provides a real limitation on our ability to operate and our ability to support partners like the emergency response rooms that the Congresswoman spoke to. They do incredibly heroic work, and we have been proud to support them from the earliest days of this conflict and continue to do so. But we are limited in the scale of our support because of those global funding cuts.
Mark from The Guardian, were you aware yet before this segment of the letter Senator Elizabeth Warren sent yesterday to U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick asking whether the administration's decision to ease export controls on the UAE was influenced by UAE-linked investment in the Trump family's crypto venture? That reported by the Washington Post, that kind of suspected Trump corruption contributing to allowing the UAE to continue supporting the genocide in Sudan?
Yeah, I was aware of it. The equation of Trump corruption, the continued backing of the Emiratis, and the inaction over Sudan. I think there's enough evidence, circumstantial at least, to suggest it requires further investigation.
And I see you've written about the UK. You're in London, you're with Guardian. You've also written about the UK being accused of enabling the UAE to continue to fuel the war. How so in the UK's case?
Yeah, it's similar basically. It's all down to money, and complicity. In the UK, the equations, is as simple as part of our investment, our economic strategy, we want Emirati investment, billions of pounds. That's been agreed. by taking that money, it effectively the deal has been, the unspoken deal, certainly publicly, has been we won't call them out. So, we've never called out the UAE over Sudan, despite having intelligence for years of what they're up to. We continue to supply arms to them. We've never called for sanctions. In the UK, it's the penholder of the UN Security Council on Sudan. It's our role to ensure the international community does what's best.
Tom in Manhattan, you're on WNYC. Hi, Tom.
Hi, good morning, Brian, and thank you to your guests for explaining the situation. And to widen it a little bit, there are a lot of other actors involved, national actors involved in Sudan, including Russia, including Ukraine, which is in Sudan fighting on the same side as Iran, which is interesting against Russia, and Turkey and others. And the wider geopolitical look at it includes links going to the Red Sea and going right through Somaliland to the Red Sea, including Israel's activities. I'm wondering if Mark, particularly Mark Townsend, could address this a little bit in terms of the wider implications geopolitically. And a quick note on genocide. Brian, you mentioned genocide in Sudan, but you didn't give it the asterisk and the holdback that you usually do when you mention genocide in Gaza, that only some people think this is happening. So thank you so much.
Because everybody thinks it's happening in Sudan. There isn't the same partisan divide over that label in this country, especially, and that's why, just to characterize something that's more universally or more disputedly deserving of that label, as it is in the political context. But Mark, go ahead and answer his question.
Yeah, and it's a good question. I mean, some people call Sudanese conflict, just a huge regional proxy war because there's so many competing interests, so many external backers. The US is trying to broker a peace deal. Abysmally, I have to say, by bringing together the Saudis, Emiratis, Egypt, and themselves. But it's getting nowhere, basically. We're just not really. The US doesn't really appear to be trying very hard to bring peace, and in terms of bringing all the disparate backers around the table, it's not happening. It's shameful, really.
Kieran, one complaint, and the last caller brought up one kind of comparison with the situation in Gaza. One complaint among people concerned with anti-Semitic singling out of Jews as they see it, and this is whether or not they support anything about the Netanyahu war policies in Gaza and Lebanon, and even if they do call them genocide. Many people concerned with anti-Semitism say the human rights and activist communities in this country and around the world do single out Israel for the intensity and centrality of the focus on that country's actions and largely ignore man-made, war-caused humanitarian crises that are just as severe, Sudan being a prime example, maybe the prime example. So not to excuse anything that's debated about Israel and Gaza, but do you find at the IRC that it's harder to get people around the U.S. and around the world as passionate about Sudan despite the scale of the suffering there?
I've been doing humanitarian work for about 26 years now, and it has always been the case that there are conflicts and crises that arouse and excite more interest and more debate than others. And it's always been the case that it's easier to get attention from the wider public and from policymakers on certain crises. So the current situation is by no means unique in that respect. It is certainly the case that we find more attention directed to crises like the conflict in Gaza, where our teams are valiantly providing humanitarian assistance. Our job as the International Rescue Committee is to provide assistance to any civilians affected by conflict around the world as best we can, wherever we can, and on the basis of humanitarian need alone. So we try to leave the politics out of it. We try to leave the politics to others and focus on delivering as best we can for as many of those people who are suffering on the ground in Sudan and in well over more than 35 countries around the world.
Mark, anything from you on that as a global development reporter for The Guardian, reporting on multiple places with severe crises like Sudan as you do?
Yeah, Gaza takes up a lot of oxygen, clearly. It's will always dominate our, or most often dominates our kind of international coverage, way more than Ukraine even. But having said that, Sudan is a huge global diaspora. It's a very engaged state in terms of its sort of civil society. So the readership of our coverage actually can be quite enormous. So that kind of gives some sort of sense of hope, I guess.
Kieran, before you go, how difficult is it to help in Sudan as an aid organization, as the International Rescue Committee is, in Sudan, or the refugees who've left Sudan, with the war continuing to rage?
Yeah, it's immensely challenging. The scale alone of over 30 million people in need of assistance, 4 million refugees have fled to neighboring countries, and the scale of the country, the size of the country, the infrastructure alone would make it a challenging environment. The conflict situation with, as I mentioned, attacks against aid workers and civilians being an ever-present part of the reality for our teams, the reductions in funding. It's just very, very difficult. And so much of the underlying infrastructure of the country has been degraded over the last years of war. 40% approximately of Sudan's health facilities are not working. That goes up as high as 80% in the areas most affected by conflict. So the basic structures that civilians depend on and that we often work through for our response just simply aren't there. And then lastly, I'll note in the context of the wider global environment these days, everywhere we work, we're seeing the impact of the closure of the Straits of Hormuz and the war in Iran on increased prices and limitations on supply chain, on availability of goods. We've had supplies destined for Sudan delayed for months earlier this year as a consequence of what's happening in the Middle East. So it's multi-layered, but it makes for a very challenging job. I mean, that's what we do. We deliver in the hardest places for those hardest to reach, but it's very, very difficult.
If there are 12 million or more refugees from there in the last few years, where are they mostly going?
Well, so a little over 9 million people are displaced internally within the country. That includes a lot of people who fled from Sudan back to their areas of origin, from Khartoum, to their areas of origin elsewhere in Sudan early on in the conflict, as well as more localized displacement within the Kordofans and Darfur in particular over the last year or so. The 4.5 million refugees who've left the country are spread around neighboring countries. For the most part, there are over 500,000 in South Sudan, nearly 1 million in Chad. There's a large number in Egypt and Ethiopia, and some have gone further afield to Libya and Uganda. Our response is very much a regional one, focused on supporting people who are stuck in Sudan, who've made the choice or who are unable to leave, as well as those who sought refuge in neighboring countries.
So last question for you, Mark. There is, of course, in this country, a movement to get the United States to stop sending arms to Israel because of what Israel is doing in Gaza. But we've talked in this segment about how the U.S. and the U.K. are enabling the UAE to help perpetrate the humanitarian crisis in Sudan, because we're continuing to send arms to them despite the objections of a few voices. Do you see any movement in the UK, and by movement I mean a popular movement, to put more pressure on the United Kingdom government to not aid and abet the humanitarian crisis via sending arms to the UAE in this way? Yeah,
it's a very similar situation to the one in the US, actually. There is a lot of, quite impassioned grassroots feelings. Some politicians are engaged, but politically, look, they made this deal with the UAE. They're dancing with the devil in terms of genocide in Sudan. That's not going to change, basically. This is a kind of we're in an era of hard power self-interest with no repercussions. We decided to back the UAE, and that means we're going to keep on sending them arms. So sadly, despite the sense of something, from the ground up beginning to kind of challenge the status quo, I can't see it changing, sadly.
Mark Townsend, Senior Global Development Reporter at The Guardian, and Kieran Donnelly, the International Rescue Committee's Senior Vice President for International Programs. Thank you both very much.
Thank
Thanks
you
very much. Thank you.